Hi, for those that are joining us, thanks for your patience. Stuff happens. We are just going to get right back on where we left off. So we really appreciate you being patient with us. And I apologize for the interruption. I see that many of you are logging back in. Thank you. I'm just waiting for our speaker to log back in and we'll just pick up where we left off. I apologize. I'm not sure what happened. She is back. I'm going to make her a co-host and we will pick up where we left off. So our speaker is back in. Hi.
Hello.
I'm so sorry. You know, stuff happens
problem.
we say technology is great when it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it looks like many of our wonderful attendees have found their way back to us. So feel
glad
free.
to hear it.
Yes, sorry, it's okay. Stuff happens and that's okay. So feel free to pick up where you left off.
I sure will. Very exciting.
You.
Yeah,
Yes.
this is how life goes when we're all remote. So thank you for everyone who is bearing with us. Maybe I don't know, maybe I was talking too long about the Maryland map and Zoom said I needed to move it along or something.
You're doing a wonderful job and we're back. And
all right.
Yes, an attendee said the weather, wind is affecting connection. So that may very well be, but we're back and I'm going to stop talking so you can start talking.
No problem. Yes, that's right. I did notice it's a very windy day. So, well, hopefully, all right. I don't know how much you all heard. So I'm just going to start on the charter. So let me get my notes back now that I'm not fighting with the connection anymore. So I'm just going to start off with, the charter for the province of Maryland. And you can always look at this later or ask me questions in Q&A if you've missed stuff. So the charter is given by Charles I to George Calvert, 1st Baron Baltimore in 1632. It is almost immediately transferred to his son Cecil, the 2nd Baron Baltimore, because of George's untimely death. This is referred to on the text under the family crest, along with their other province in Newfoundland called Avalon. And I think I was starting to say that Charles I grants this he grants this province to the Calvert family because they are a Catholic family. And so this is meant to be a 12 million acre refuge for English Catholics. But conveniently, this new colony also cuts off the power of the Dutch colony of New Netherland to the north from expanding any further south. And that would definitely be a good thing for King Charles. It is named for his wife, the Catholic Queen Consort Henrietta Maria. So the first Maryland colonists arrive on what was yesterday. They arrive on the 25th of March, 1634, which is now celebrated as Maryland Day. So if you had multicolored bagels and lots of colorful orange and red foods yesterday, that's probably why, if you live here. So you can see that the first capital is on the front mouse. The first capital is here, St. Mary's City, which still exists down in St. Mary's County. And the county names relate to the Calvert family in their title. You can also see the family seal here. It probably looks familiar to you because this is the pattern that becomes part of the Maryland state flag. And another thing that's interesting is this family motto. It's in archaic Italian, fatti maschi parole femmine, manly deeds and womanly words, which is apparently a well-known phrase in 17th century England, and George Calvert picked it to be the motto for his family in 1622. It is more generally translated now as strong deeds, gentle words, and it is still in use. I researched this a little bit as I was curious, and I saw it as the title and the main point of an address from 1984 to the Society of Surgical Oncology by that society's president, and he used it to make the case for a humanitarian but bold approach to surgical intervention in cancer. And I am not a women's studies scholar, but I do think it's very interesting to have a binary established on gendered lines with this philosophy that sounds a little bit like a precursor to the Roosevelt Corollary. So anyway, moving on. Another thing that is notable here is what changed over the previous decades. You remember that the John Smith map, which now feels like I talked about it a year ago, but the John Smith map was 1612, and now we're in 1671, again, using a design from 1635. So what's changed, not only that Maryland now exists, but also that it has already had some boundary disputes and it will have more. The northern border for now is the 40th parallel. This is eventually replaced by the Mason-Dixon line after Penn gets his charter for Pennsylvania, and that causes a border inconsistency that results in war. The southern border is the length of the Potomac River, which is still true, but and you can see how it continues over essentially into the ocean. So this had already caused some issues with the Virginia colonists. There was war and also a rebellion in 1650 when Protestant Virginians took over this Catholic colony, which was later restored to the Calvert family in 1658. And the map is being published in the aftermath of that turmoil. After this maps publication, that kind of turmoil happens again in the 1680s with the Virginia Protestants taking over. And that time Catholic repression in Maryland continues until the American Revolution. There's no Delaware yet, but that gets established by bisecting the eastern shore a little while before the Mason-Dixon line is established also in the next century. And you can note the references they're still there, but they're much smaller to the tribes that we know were making these people very nervous. So they don't have an issue with the Piscataway, who are mentioned here through the city that now bears their name, Piscataway. And this is where they still live in Prince George's County, but it's a different story for the Susquehannocks. So the province of Maryland goes to war with the Susquehannocks in the 1640s, and the Susquehannocks defeat them, which makes an uneasy peace settle in that lasts until the Susquehannocks are all but wiped out by war and disease coming from the north. And you can almost see that here in the way they're given this kind of status, like this is, beyond this point we don't go kind of thing in this otherwise unpopulated portion of the map. And also it's worth noting the Virginia history that shows up on this map. You see Jamestown, which of course is the first permanent settlement of British North America, as built in 1607. And you also see Point Comfort, which is the site where the first African captives of British America are taken in 1619 to be enslaved. Maryland followed suit when the first African captives were brought here to St. Mary's City in 1642. And in 1664, Charles Calvert, the third Baron Baltimore, approves rule by the Assembly that establishes perpetual slavery. And thus begins the chattel slavery of the Chesapeake Bay plantations in the time period covered by this map, with consequences that the state has had to grapple with ever since. So John Smith's map is reinterpreted several times as the colonial boundaries expand. The last one widely agreed as being the 1676 map by John Speed for his Atlas of the Empire of Great Britain. It's in much the same vein as the other two maps you've seen, although of course the boundaries are changing, shifting. There's more here. Now there's South Carolina, or excuse me, now there's Carolina, there's North Carolina eventually. And one really interesting detail is that there is a Baltimore on this map, but it's in the wrong place. So this is old Baltimore, now the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and the location shifts because of the shifting manners and plantations of the old families, plus new and shifting counties. There are actually several places that use the name Baltimore, and the town that we now know as Baltimore City doesn't get established until 1729, although the port is established in 1706. Map designs take a while to change, just because, of course, printing was very different in those days and took a lot longer. So we don't see Baltimore on the Patapsco River for a couple more decades. And that brings us to what I believe is the first real appearance, although there may be people who have other opinions. So this is Thomas Kitchen's 1757 map for the London Magazine. It's the first map in our collection that shows Baltimore where we know it now. And I'm not sure if it's the first map that shows Baltimore in its correct location, but I haven't found an earlier one. So it might be, or at least it's probably based on what was the earliest. The regional boundaries and the city names are much closer to what we know today. So not only is Baltimore on the Patapsco where it should be, but also you see Delaware and you see the state boundaries around the Chesapeake being a bit more solid now. As the port becomes significant for the geographic reasons I discussed earlier, and the city of Baltimore begins to grow haphazardly around it, mapping naturally turns to Baltimore itself, which is the next point to discuss in our map journey. So this is the first attempt to map the city of Baltimore. It's the AP Foley map of 1792. It tracks the immense post-colonial growth of Baltimore and other American cities that are now booming and under new post-revolution administration. You can note the many ships clustered around Fells Point, and some are all the way at the Inner Harbor too, which was then called the Basin. And there's also a massive woodland called Howard's Park to the north of the city. Howard's Land, which you might know from Howard Street, became today's Mount Vernon neighborhood. And you can also see the change in the seal, the state seal here, which is, it looks a lot more like Maryland's current seal. The farmer and the fisherman are the state's most glorified denizens. Next, we have Charles Varl's 1801 map. It is the second and more popular attempt to map the city of Baltimore. And you can guess just from the color alone why it would be more popular. So because of the color, it's even easier to notice the unfinished nature of the city's streets and the ghostly tracing. This is a city that rapidly expanded around a very busy port with quite a few waterways and bound by giant plantations at its northern edges. So understanding the streets and delineations are practically guesswork for Foley and for Varl. So all the yellow regions in this map are the unlabeled and unfinished areas of the city where he just really couldn't conclusively say what was there, who lived there, et cetera. And it's not until the 1820s that real surveying happens. And that brings us to Poppleton's map. I apologize. This is supposed to display as a square, as you might imagine. And hopefully if you play with this later on your own browser, it will. I don't know why this is happening to me, but picture this, this section of the map being up here and this section of the map being down here and this one being over, and you get the square that looks like Baltimore as we know it today. So apologies that this is not the visualization you would hope for this really important and interesting map. But the Poppleton map is begun in the 1810s. It's published in 1822 the first time. Here it's shown corrected. He published again, and it's corrected to 1852. He was answering the city's 1811 call for a survey that was 300 feet to the inch. And this map was so useful for Baltimore that it was used with continual revisions well into the 1880s before other more conclusive surveys were done. The city has expanded north. So you can now see that there is a Mount Vernon. You'll have to take my word for it with the way this is displaying, but you can see Mount Vernon if you look at these later. And the well-known Washington Monument, which is finished in 1829, is on this map. You can also see the pattern down here in this, what is supposed to be the lower right corner of the map. You can see this image of it's a nostalgic image that says Baltimore in 1752. It's kind of a, a sort of dreamy vision of what the inner harbor looked like before it was super settled in 1752. And this image gets reprinted. It is used many times in newspapers, and we have other copies of it as it gets reprinted later on. You can also see, if you play with this map on your own and zoom in, there is a quarantine line here. That's what this little line is here. This ghostly labeling is the quarantine line that is off of Fort McHenry. This is set up after the yellow fever outbreak of the 1790s. And there's a hospital and quarantine station set up at Hawkins Point. At first it was Fairfield, but the larger ships couldn't get close enough. And these persist in some form until the city shut it down and moved medical care inland. But it really didn't fully shut down in that form until the 1970s. This was in use for a very long time. The idea of quarantining ships and quarantining goods is a very old one, of course, in world trade. So also looking at this map, again, if you can zoom in later, you may be able to see some of the detail of it. So over here, and again, you'll just have to zoom in later and take my word for it for now. This is Mount Clair Station, which shows the major cause of Baltimore's continuing expansion at this time period, which is the railroad. This is what really made Baltimore the city that it became. In the 1820s, prominent Baltimore businessmen had been researching railroads in England with the aim of what was essentially a transportation arms race. The Erie Canal had opened in 1825, and numerous other canals were following. They were all the rage, and the fear was that places that could naturally accommodate canals, including future big Great Lakes cities such as Chicago, would eclipse Baltimore and send it to financial ruin. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad opened at this spot in 1830, making it the oldest railroad in the United States and saving Baltimore from this fate. With its branches and subsidiaries, the railroad connected the deep port of Baltimore not only to the interior farmland of Maryland to Pennsylvania, but also to the Trans-Appalachian traffic of people moving west. It made Baltimore even more of a transportation and cargo hub, but it also became a crucial part of the Union victory during the Civil War, despite the support of many Marylanders for the Confederacy. And you can also notice, if you look at this, that there are many, many wharves that are shown along, especially Fells Point. So this port area, not so much the railroads, but the port area would have made up the city as Frederick Douglass would have known it when he was here as a preteen and teenager in the 1820s. He apparently bought his copy of the Columbian Orator, which was a very influential text that taught him rhetoric and history, from a bookshop on Thames Street in Fells Point. And so I've included a quote here from his autobiography from the chapter when he describes coming to Baltimore and the opportunities that opened to him when he was taught to read while he was living here, and gave him the opportunity to see what it might be like to live as a free man. So this is a nice long quote that makes reference to places like Alexander Street where he lived, which still very much exists in Fells Point. But I'll read the latter part so you'll see where I got the idea for the talk. It is possible and even quite probable that but for the mere circumstances of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind providence, which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. So Baltimore is becoming a very big deal to a lot of people like Douglas. It's a foundation and gateway indeed. Because of Maryland's long and complicated history with slavery, nearly half the state's population was Black. And even before the Civil War, about half of that population was free. Baltimore's growth may have had something to do with this, because since the city became rich from trade with interior farmland, where there wasn't slave labor the way the southern tobacco planter counties had, plus the growth of abolitionist Methodist preaching camps in Maryland, especially on the Eastern Shore, more and more wealthy Marylanders were manumitting the people they enslaved, usually freeing them upon death. Slavery, frankly, wasn't as profitable in Baltimore's mid-19th century economy as it had been, plus there was a growing moral objection to it. The tensions over this with the wealthy planter class would split opinion in Maryland widely over slavery and over the Civil War as a whole, so that Maryland housed many Confederate sympathizers despite being a Union state, and it paved the way for the many Confederate monuments that were built in Baltimore decades after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, the city gained about 20,000 people. It continued to expand to accommodate all the resulting industry, which is a pattern that you can start to see here as you see these proposed outlines for the city to get bigger and bigger. German and Irish immigrants had started coming in droves around the 1840s, although there had been migrants since the beginning, including Germans who were working in the mills and on the farms southward along the rivers from Pennsylvania since colonial times. Many more Europeans come in over the course of the 19th century, so that Baltimore becomes the second biggest port of entry for immigration to the US after New York. Migration would continue to come in waves well into the 20th century, including from other parts of the country. During World War II, the population swelled with poor white Southerners moving to Baltimore for work, and many stayed to work for Bethlehem Steel after the war. In the meantime, there had long been attempts from the city to take on more land from the surrounding areas as its tax base, because these areas had remained largely in private hands and the people living there used city amenities. This map is from 1874 with this proposed addition on the edges, but Baltimore County voters rejected that expansion by referendum over and over again until 1888, and there were further land expansions in the 20th century. And as a side note, if you look at this later and you look really closely, Johns Hopkins Hospital is labeled here in its correct current location. The university and the hospital had originally been planned for Hopkins Clifton Estate, but for financial management reasons after his death, the hospital was moved to the site of a previous city hospital in East Baltimore in the 1870s. And the university, the Homewood Campus University we know, was built on the former Homewood Estate in 1902, which is still private land at the point of this map. And while this is all happening, the Black community has been fighting for self-determination and full rights under the law. Adding to the population of free Blacks living here before and during the Civil War, many more come after, including as part of the Great Migration of the 20th century. The Black community in Baltimore was very influential and very educated, and during Reconstruction, many Black Baltimoreans fought discrimination successfully through legal means and community organizing. But in response, white Baltimore struck back, as did the rest of the country, with terrorist acts of intimidation and Jim Crow laws. I do not have the time or the expertise to discuss this important piece of city history, but I do have a link here that you can see later to a really amazing site that uses maps and historical documents to trace the progress of the Black community, as well as how segregation shrank where the Black community could live and work in Baltimore, and how the fight for civil rights basically never stopped. Baltimore was a segregated city well into the 20th century, to the point that Black students at Hopkins had trouble finding housing and other amenities open to them around campus, which was brought to the attention of university administration and the wider Hopkins population during the activism of the 1960s. Segregationist and white supremacist tendencies ran heavily through the city and state, leading to problems for Black workers being able to get the same jobs as their white peers, as well as housing discrimination and suffocation of the neighborhoods to which they were relegated. The closing of really important job creators in the 20th century, like Bethlehem Steel, had an outsized effect not only on skyrocketing unemployment and increased poverty, but also in hostile labor and politics disputes along racial and ethnic lines. So this leads us to a section I refer to as the closing gateway, with a really jaw-dropping quote. I think is useful for understanding this period of Baltimore's design history. So this is a reference from the Roland Park papers. We actually have this collection here at Hopkins under the map. I've linked to the archives record. This quote is from the company's list of nuisances that refers to the rules for its property. The Roland Park Company, which was also written up in a Hopkins magazine article that I've linked here below as well, founded one of the very first all-white garden suburbs. It was originally planned in the 1890s on lands that had been part of the county, but again was annexed by the city in 1918. So this map that I have here is from a later development of theirs, the Homeland neighborhood. And it says in no uncertain terms up in the upper left that this land was meant to be restricted. And you can tell from the nuisances who it was meant to be restricted against. You can also note the incredible attention to detail in appearances of the houses in these neighborhoods. There's a handwritten edition here about the Japanese beetle tracking in the area, which probably refers to the type of regulation flowers that were allowed on the lawns and how important it was for them to really look their best for the people living in this neighborhood. And this is another topic that could be a whole other talk, but if you'd like to know more about the history of racist housing covenants, which while pioneered here in Baltimore became the norm all over the United States, I particularly recommend searching for the Mapping Prejudice Project from the University of Minnesota, which did a comprehensive analysis of racial covenants used to make the Twin Cities predominantly white in many areas in the early 20th century. I also have below this an even more notorious and a slightly better known example of racist design. This is the 1937 Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map, as it's commonly known. It wasn't called a redlining map, but that's what it's referred to now, 1937 map of Baltimore. They made these maps with the aim of not granting mortgages to people living in the red areas of the city, which are noted as being, in some of the documentation about these maps, they're noted as being very non-white and having too many foreigners. And this is another topic I don't have the time or expertise to discuss, but I have linked the Mapping Inequality project here below, which features work done by one of our very own professors at Hopkins, Nathan Connolly, and it tracks the history of redlining around the country. And you can read some of the documentation that I've just quoted. So lastly, on this theme of really unpleasant racist design, I want to mention something that actually wasn't meant to be exclusive. It didn't have the same exclusive kind of ideals that these other examples did. It was a well-meaning but ultimately problematic solution of housing projects. So these images that I've got here are from a redevelopment proposal that was submitted for the city in 1945 in response to the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of Baltimore City, as people had crowded in for work in previous decades, especially during World War II, when it was really booming, like I mentioned. So the people who wanted to fix what they were now calling urban blight decided to build housing projects in former tenement areas in particular, which had the problematic effect of equating housing where non-white populations had been forcibly segregated with poverty and bad housing. So this thus further encoded discriminatory design and architecture and urban planning. And that's why, you know, to this day, if somebody says the projects, you don't picture nice housing, right? And you can see the beginning of this here with maps that essentially function as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's a paragraph right here that says how the principal non-white areas, unfortunately, are the same areas that are most blighted. And there are some maps referred to in this paragraph that I've also linked through the swipe feature on this slide. So if you want to play with this later, you can use the swipe arrows to look at the overlays here. So the principal blight map looks really similar to the principal non-white areas. Once again, encoding discrimination further in the name of social progress. So this brings me to the last section of my talk. I want to call this Old Foundations, New Gateways. I want to end on a note of looking to what our maps of Baltimore can accomplish for the future. They do bear witness to a complicated past full of heroics, but also grave misdeeds. And it's really interesting and important to see what they can contribute as we move on to the next phase of the city's history. There are more fascinating digital projects using maps than I can possibly count on the internet these days, which is really delightful for a map librarian. But I will close with just two examples that happen to use our maps from J Scholarship. So first, there's this article from the Bloomberg City Lab that came out a few years ago. I've got screenshots, but also the link to the article. This describes a project to track streets across the country that are named after Martin Luther King. So you may have noticed, and this is the case in Baltimore, for example, where it's delineated here in yellow, and this is separating black and white areas of the city, the green being black and the purplish pink being predominantly white areas. So Martin Luther King Boulevard is often a name that you see on large boulevards across the country that are hard for pedestrians to cross, and they do tend to pass through areas of town so that they will bisect white and black neighborhoods. And this is a direct result of the riots after Martin Luther King's death in 1968. It was essentially the hostile actions of urban planners around the country. They used federal highway money to make it harder for Black people to organize, although they were also making it easier to get in and out of the city. And so they did provide some transportation benefits that had made them, that had made their more insidious side a little easier to cover. So this article uses the researchers in this article keep track of the discrimination in areas that use MLK Boulevard in the name or use names like MLK Boulevard. It's used for accountability and also suggesting public policy to ameliorate effects of racism in city planning and ways that these streets can kind of be reclaimed through various urban landscaping projects. And you'll see that one of the maps that they use to discuss this is one of our 1957 plan maps in J Scholarship mentioned right in the article. And lest you think that I only have depressing things to tell you about, I have one last example that I really love. So this is a YouTube video from, and I've also linked his website, from Salvage Arc, which is the project of a local amateur archaeologist named Evan Woodward, who does these really great projects where he goes around and finds remnants of Baltimore's industrial past. He goes and finds things, for example, like this soda bottle from a very long time ago, and he tends to sell them and donate the profits to the Baltimore Museum of Industry and Work. And so I linked an example here that you can look at. And what's really great is I've confirmed this with him. I've talked to him about it, and he uses J Scholarship maps specifically for some of his research, especially atlases that show old industrial buildings and grand homes. So that is where I want to end for today. And I know that with the delays, we've gone way over time, but I'm still happy to answer some questions as long as that is preferred to be done by our lovely panelists and any of you who have patiently waited with questions. And as I promised, there is a link down here at the bottom. You have to make sure you get this capitalization exactly right or the link won't work, but this is a link to this presentation if you would like to look at it again and play with all of the different links that I've teased you with here.
Well, thank you so much. And we will share a link to your whole presentation in the follow-up email. I do have some questions I'd love to share. Was Fells Point a separate city at first, if you know?
I do not believe so. So Fells Point is so old as far as to how the port kind of grows up. It gets the name of, I think, one of the people who sort of staked it out. That happened a lot with Baltimore, that it was kind of these big entrepreneurial, larger than life figures would stake out various areas that then bear their name. And some of them become big plantations, some of them become these wharves, some of them become the points like Fells Point. But so that was somebody who essentially got in early with shipping. And so I don't think that it's a separate city ever, but it is, it kind of grows haphazardly into the rest of the city as Baltimore, especially with the whole naming issue, it's very fuzzy at first. And as you saw in those early maps, the city is kind of these different points that don't even necessarily connect to each other except by water, but that are considered the same part. So I don't believe it was ever a separate city.
Okay, well, thank you. So were these maps mass produced or printed in small numbers? And what publishing methods were used, if you know?
Yeah, so that certainly depends on the time period. These are all the maps that I've shown here. They're not manuscript maps. So these are mass produced. Now, mass produced, of course, in the 17th century was not what it means now. You know, mass produced in the 17th century could be 50 maps. So it just depended on the production value and all that kind of thing. These earlier maps would have been published in a lot of different places. They would have been published in these big atlases usually. A lot of old maps, including ours, are originally in atlases, even if we have them as separate sheets now. And so they would have been published usually by engraving in the case of those early maps. They are later in the 19th century, it tends to be by lithograph, and later by chromolithograph. But coloring a map is actually very expensive, and it was done by hand for a really long time, even into the time period when chromolithography was possible. Because it was such an expensive technology, it ended up still being cheaper to pay people to color by hand. And this was apparently done, I just found out yesterday from a really interesting presentation from a colleague of mine, that was done even into the 20th century. But so it would have been, usually hand coloring, and which would have been done by the publisher. It could be done by the person who got the map if they got. We do have records, some interesting records, especially in the early modern period, of people getting the black and white version, the non-color version of a map, and then kind of coloring it in how they wanted to, almost like they're doing, like almost like a coloring book, essentially. But so these would have been mainly engraved before about 1800, and then mainly lithographed and often published in books, which hopefully answered the question. But yes, these are all, they're not unique, and they're still rare and interesting, but they're not unique because of the fact that they're printed maps. There are other copies of these maps. That doesn't mean that they're all the same. There are definite differences. The color could be done differently between maps, and also you saw that there were a few examples of manuscript annotations that people have put in.
Yeah, they're absolutely fascinating. Are they available for purchase, or reprints available for purchase?
We don't do that. I mean, if you go to J Scholarship, you can download these images yourself. They are, we have a whole page of legalese about, what constitutes fair use, and the fact that this is an open access repository. So, certainly please don't go off and sell them somewhere or something like that. But I can link resources to that if people want to know more about how J Scholarship works. We don't have any kind of retail setup where you can buy them. But if you have the images, there's nothing stopping you from essentially doing what I'll never know if you want to kind of blow it up and print it out yourself somewhere. We certainly have. I've seen people do that numerous times. So just don't tell us about it. But no, I'm just kidding. It's fine. But yes, you can't buy them from us, but you can definitely download these and use them, for example, in a paper that you're giving or something like that.
Well, that's wonderful. So I have another question. Did Benjamin Banneker do any surveying or mapping near Baltimore?
Not that I know of. I have not seen any descriptions of him being active here in my research about some of those early maps. I could have missed it. It could be that he did, but I do not know of any examples where he would have been the one doing the surveying here. So not that I know of, I guess, is the answer.
Okay, that's okay. So does the library own maps reflecting the Penn-Calvert disputes that reflected the changes in boundaries across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania?
Yes, we do have some. Now, the interesting and difficult thing about maps, of course, is that sometimes they're very clear about this is a map about this dispute. And sometimes it's not, that's not in the title. The title will be Pennsylvania, but it'll have some little note, or it'll show the boundary line, even if there's no other text about it. So sometimes finding the information in a map can be the part where you have to be really creative. We do have maps that show the dispute. I definitely, because I didn't want this talk to take 3 hours, I definitely pared down a lot to mostly focus on Baltimore itself, or, in the case of the very early maps, what preceded Baltimore. So I didn't include very much of the kind of non-Baltimore specific historic things that I talked about. But yes, we do. And I'd be happy to look into that if somebody has a research question based on that.
Fair enough. So Jim Garrett, and Jim, we're so happy you're here. He noted that he believes the area east of the Jones Falls was originally a separate town called Jonestown, and that area may have included Fells Point, which was named for William Fells. So just an interesting point from Mr. Garrett. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very helpful clarification for sure. So I did say that I didn't think Fells Point was a separate city. Now the different towns and things, as far as, and that could also be kind of a misinterpretation of the question on my part, because certainly towns getting established with the very strict boundaries that they have now, that's a really recent phenomenon, as you kind of saw and heard. Places could shift boundaries a lot, especially in earlier days for this country. And so for sure, you have these different little pockets that are sort of separate. They're separate towns, so to speak. And then in Jonestown, certainly, yes, that was definitely a separate area that later becomes, integrated into what is Baltimore. But that's definitely a fair point that Jonestown may have included Fells Point, and I appreciate the clarification.
Very interesting. Another question, I think it's our last question, unless anybody else has any more, please put them in the Zoom Q&A. What is the Roosevelt Corollary?
Oh yeah, so the Roosevelt Corollary is the addition that Theodore Roosevelt made to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is an early I think it's 1907 or so. Maybe somebody knows who will put it in the Q&A, which is absolutely fine with me, because that's definitely not something I researched carefully. But I just vaguely remember learning from school that it's around then. So the Roosevelt Corollary is speak softly and carry a big stick. So that was the point that I was trying to make, is that I think that and this is just me talking, I didn't see evidence to this, but I think it's interesting that that's kind of it's clearly a very old American idea, that your words should be soft and then your actions are what define you, and they should be very bold. And that was done, that was given in a very specific colonial context, or I should say an imperial context about Latin America.
Great. What is there a social group for people interested in maps that you know?
Yes, actually, there are quite a few. So if you're local, or if you're, I guess, regional, I should say, in the Maryland area, there is the Washington Map Society, which I could not recommend more highly. They're an absolutely wonderful group, and you can join, and they're doing everything virtually right now, but they have really great Zoom presentations from lots of very interesting qualified speakers who have a lot more formal training in map history than I do, frankly. They give really interesting, wonderful talks on pretty much a monthly basis. And so if you look them up, the Washington Map Society is great. There are map societies all over the country, though. There's one in New York, there's one in Boston, which, full disclosure, I was part of when I lived in Boston. And there are West Coast societies and a Chicago Map Society as well. So if you have trouble looking those up, you know, I can try and help you out. But there are definitely map societies. Probably there's one where you live.
Great, that's so great. Well, we're at the top of the next hour, and I really appreciate your time and your talent today. I appreciate our audience members for putting up with our technical glitch. I'm not sure what happened, but I'm so glad that you were able to find us again and join us. So I especially wanted to thank you for your time and talent and your information. We'll follow up this program with a recording of probably what is the first and the second half of the program, and a list of resources, and, you know, just share with me anything you want to share with the audience. And I do have the link to your presentation. I'll be sharing that with everybody who attended. So thank you everyone for being here. Special thanks to our speaker. Everyone, get out there if you're in Maryland and enjoy this beautiful weather. So thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and come to more of our programs. We'd love to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.